on TV, on radio, and on your smartphone. This is talkTV.
A very, very good evening and a big welcome to Jeremy Kyle Investigates. Now tonight, for some, you look at gambling, you think, well, it's just a little flutter on the Grand National. I might have a couple of quid on the National Lottery each and every week. But for others, and I have to say I wanted to do this because many people will know that I had a problem with gambling in the past. And for some, this is an addiction that can have tragic consequences. The NHS saw nearly 1,400 patients last year, an increase of nigh on 40% from the previous 12 months. And you know what, my friends, if we continue at that rate, it'll be in the tens of thousands in absolutely no time at all. So my question tonight is, does the UK have a problem with gambling? In the next 60 minutes, we'll hear from a man who unbelievably stole £250,000 from his employer to feed his habit. I discuss with an MP her campaign for legal reform. And we'll ask the question, is it right that so many football clubs have betting firms as their sponsors? That is all coming up on a programme that, for me, is really important. I'm not against gambling. I guess what tonight's about is, how do we deal with the problem with the people who find it so very difficult?
From the National Lottery to fruit machines to bookmakers and casinos, the UK has one of the biggest gambling markets in the world, generating an annual profit of over £14 billion. According to a recent Public Health England report, 44% of the population gambled in some form. About 250,000 people are classified as problem gamblers, and 2.2 million people are at-risk gamblers. But it isn't just those who gamble that suffer. A further 7% are affected negatively by other people's gambling. That's over 4 million people. The cost to the country isn't small either. Gambling is estimated to cost society almost £1.3 billion a year. But the cost isn't just monetary. Homelessness, mental health issues and suicides are all consequences of problem gambling. Earlier this year, the Gambling Commission fined a bookmaker over £19 million for failures, which included allowing a customer to spend a whopping £23,000 in just 20 minutes. In a world where gambling is as easy as picking up your phone, how big a problem is gambling?
Earlier, I spoke with someone who learned firsthand how problematic gambling can be, Tom Eaton. I started by asking him how his addiction began. Have a watch.
So my story began probably, I don't know, when I was 17, 18. It was minor gambling at that point, just a few pound here and there in the bookies. It probably got worse as the years went on, and predominantly when online gambling come into play. And that's when it really spiraled out of control for me, really.
You were working for Dunelm as
Correct.
a finance manager, and your story, and it's so candid of you, and it's really important for the basis of what we're talking about, online gambling and people with addictions, that being fed by, the ability for people with few checks to just get huge amounts of credit. You stole more than £250,000 to fund this addiction. How did you do that?
A lot of ways that, obviously I'm not proud of in any shape or form. Being a manager, I had a lot of responsibility there, which meant that a lot of the things I did probably went under the radar. I was getting credit cards out of my name. Money that was due to be refunded back to the company was coming back directly to my bank account. Obviously, like I said, it's not a time I'm particularly proud of in my life.
Listen, years ago, I don't know if you know this about me, I had a problem with gambling, so I completely get that this is difficult, not maybe cathartic, probably difficult to open up about it. But opening up about it is not condoning it. In fact, what it does is it perhaps highlights how it can grab people and the responsibility of these organisations that I think, should stand up and be counted. You spontaneously confessed to your bosses. I mean, as the debt built between you and me, you knew you were going to be caught, didn't you?
100%. And I think that's half of the reason why it got to the stage it did. I was so afraid of getting caught as such, afraid of what I stood to lose. I knew that I'd obviously lose my job, I'd lose my career, there's losing friendships, family. So all of that was obviously playing on my mind. and my
And the hope,
mindset,
of course, that you're going to have the big victory and put it all back, because that's what all gamblers
Exactly.
have, right? It's just round the corner.
Exactly. That was always my intention as well. Like I gambled more to pay more back, but because I was in such a spiral, I was losing more and taking. It was just like a continuous circle of bad decisions, basically.
It's just a hamster wheel of it's so terrifying and so terrible, and I'm totally with you. But you did own up. You were jailed for 27 months. At that moment, when that gavel went down and you are heading to jail, what are you thinking?
Just how I've let everyone down. You know, I was married at the time. I've got 2 young kids, and the thought of being away from them was always the worst thing. You know, I'm not by any stretch the most strongest person, maybe mentally or physically, but I knew that I could just crack on with it. But being away from people, that was the worst bit for me.
It's absolutely true to say, actually, not just in your words, but the judge in the case said he was revolted by the tactics this particular company, BetSafe, used to reel you in, knowing that you were sinking in a sea of debt. They showered you with personal gifts. Just tell us a bit about that, because no responsibility from them to do something about somebody who was obviously floundering big time.
Well, that's it, yeah. I mean, I was getting given free money to gamble with. It was into the thousands bracket. They contacted me directly through WhatsApp and said that my account manager wanted to speak to me because he got tickets to a Man City game, all expenses paid for in a box. We got things like that. And every time, I mean, I always point back to messages I was getting. And I said to my account manager, "Oh, I'm really struggling. I'm not winning anything." And he goes, "Oh, here's £500. Hopefully your luck will change." And
I mean, that could almost, wrong word perhaps, but that's almost predatory, isn't it? Because they presumably knew that you were in that terrible cycle of well, let's be honest, you con yourself, you lie to everybody, you believe in your mind that it's just round the corner, as we said, and even at those moments when you probably want to throw in the towel and go, "I can't do this," they're reeling you in with more and more. Do you, and this is a really important point, I think, for the show, and that, what I love about your story, I spoke to Holes, is that you don't blame anybody else. But when you look at it as I do, the online companies need to take huge responsibility, don't they? I mean, we're not saying they forced you to gamble in the first place, but certainly when those red flags were raised, they didn't do anything to help you.
No, I mean, I've always used the word accountability, and I've always took accountability for my actions. You know, they didn't hold a gun to my head. They didn't tell me to steal money. Like that was on me, and I live with that now for the rest of my life. But yeah, there needs to be some sort of, again, accountability with these companies. They have these procedures, alleged procedures in place. They have these licenses. They constantly break all of the conditions of these licenses, and nothing ever gets done about it. And
I mean, online gambling, some of the controls are ludicrous, and certainly in my mind, doing this, it's to highlight the fact that there should be greater control. What I love about what you just said, Tommy, is that nobody held a gun to your head, you did it. Do you think that if online gambling, that's so obvious to us all, 24 hours a day, you can bet on how many buses are going to turn up, or it's going to snow on December the 25th, you can do it online 24 hours a day. Do you think your particular story would have been the same? Because as you said, they didn't force you to steal. Do you think that you and the addiction, the thrill, the rush, I'm going to sort this out, do you think that would have been there anyway?
Potentially. Maybe not to the extent that it did. I'd like to think if I didn't have everything at the touch of my fingertips, then maybe I could have dealt with things a little bit better. Again, it's not blaming anyone else. It's nothing along them lines. It's more trying to figure out, in my mind, would I have gone down that same path? I personally don't think I would, because I always did most of my gambling online. I always had this mindset of I could never justify handing cash over. Whereas obviously with online, it's just digits, it's just numbers. It doesn't feel real.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'm really, really proud of you doing this, and I mean that. What about now? How are you doing now, kiddo?
Yeah. Life's different now. Unfortunately, me and my wife split up. But we get on well for the children. I've got shared custody of the kids. I have them nearly half the time
Good boy.
each week. I've got my own place. I'm moving forward. I'm doing well at work, and life's busy, but I still have moments. I've had relapses. I still have to try and figure out in my mind how I manage the addiction and because it'll always be with me. It doesn't just go away. It's unfortunately that's me now, and it's just about how I try and manage all these triggers and keep on the right path really.
Fascinating. Joining me to discuss this now is a man who specialises in addiction, neuropsychopharmacologist. How about that, Professor David Nutt? And in the studio, co-founder of the Gamblers Consumer Forum, Abby McGregor. Welcome both. Abby, if I can start with you. I want to sort of split this programme into different segments. I want to start by talking about the causes of addiction, but perhaps the warning signs. So if you are a gambler, we've both been chatting, during that interview, that we both have a punt. What are the warning signs that it becomes more than that? And what about, not only should one look for, but what about people around you?
Well, I think what that video shows is that there are two distinct groups of people. The over 99% of healthy gamblers who gamble and don't need to be subject to any restrictions, and those small amounts that are addicted. And there is a clear cognitive difference between those two groups of people. Because if there wasn't, why isn't everybody addicted? We have to get away from this idea that everyone could be one better way from addiction. And there are all sorts of warning signs that we can see that aren't to do with money, because that's just a means to access the addiction, that aren't to do with your spending habits. What they're to do with is evidence of compulsion. You must gamble regardless of the consequences.
Interesting. David, welcome to Jeremy Kyle Investigates. Can you, from your point of view, why do gambling addictions occur for people?
Well, gambling addictions are part of a series of other addictions, and they all occur because there's a network in the brain, which is an incentive network, which drives people to do things that give them pleasure. And that for most of us, we can balance the pleasures with the pain. But in addictions, and it's certainly gambling addiction is one of them, once you start to get into that routine of looking for the pleasure, with gambling, you don't get much of it. You've got to do an awful lot of work to get the odd rewards.
I would say not pleasure, having been there myself. I think it's the rush. I think it's the thrill. I think it's that opportunity to achieve something you don't want. Is there one particular person, I mean the sort of type of person, David, who is susceptible to gambling addiction, or can it strike anybody?
Well, there are vulnerability factors. So there are people who have poor impulse control. There are people who have obsessive and compulsive tendencies. Those are the two sort of main groups of people who get vulnerable. And then there are the others who accidentally win a lot to start with, and then find that they sort of flip their brain into a state where they feel that they're always going to win. So they kind of, the first lucky winners are more vulnerable than the others.
It's interesting what Abby said. Abby says that we have to be careful not to say that every single gambler, because there's many, I mean, there might be 300,000 problem gamblers. That was from the DCMS on the government website. But there's millions of people that have a bet in this country, David, who do not have an addiction. How do we find the difference? What's the answer?
Well, we think the answer is to do a bit more research, actually, to try to look at what those vulnerability factors are. Some of them will be genetic. Some of them will definitely be in how the brain responds to the cues of addiction. I mean, we've done some very elegant work looking at how the brains of people light up when you show them the particular gambling cues that they enjoy, and we can show that gamblers do have a very distorted preference for things like roulette wheels or playing cards, and they also, importantly, they have a deficiency of getting positive reactivity to what gives most of us pleasure, like conversations or nature or pets or family.
Interesting. Can I just bring you back in, Abby, before we move on? Lots to talk about in the next hour. You make that point that we have to be very careful, that we don't jump on a bandwagon and say all gamblers are wrong. Who do you believe is responsible for finding the difference? How are we going to do it? Briefly, what's the answer?
Well, I think first you have to be able to identify them, and in order to do that...
Well, should that be the company? Should it be the individual? Everybody's having a go, maybe rightly, about these companies seducing people. That story, that company was appalling. They were giving him free money to gamble. Theirs is a responsibility, but it was in him before they, what? Worked on his vulnerability? I don't know.
Well, I think the bookmakers have to have harm markers to flag up possible signs of addictive behaviour. But it's important that those harm markers are clinical and cognitive indicators. They are not to do with people's spending habits. Addiction is cognitive. Whether you believe you can catch it from a casino, which I do not believe is true, or it's to do with, as David said, the dopamine regulation in your brain, it's a cognitive clinical condition and it must be treated as such.
Very interesting. We'll continue. We've got an hour. This is fantastic. Next on JK Investigates, problem gambling costs the UK up to 1.7 billion quid a year. Coming up, we'll hear from an MP who wants to crack down on gambling firms, online firms, putting profits over people's lives. We're coming back in 3.
Good evening, I'm Piers Morgan, uncensored in New York City.
Yeah.
King Piers and King Hugh.
I think it's only room for one king, man. You know what I'm saying?
He's mocked your weight, Trump.
Yeah, look at him. Fail. Stop working.
Just because they're skin folk don't mean they're kin folk.
Do you believe you can win this war?
He's making me cry again.
They're trying to force you out.
Yes, I feel betrayed.
Keep it award-winning. Mwah.
Hugh Edwards has been revealed as the presenter at the centre of the BBC scandal.
He is the most important television presenter on the BBC that we pay for.
Whatever torture he may have been going through, in some way is an excuse for what appears to be an abuse of power.
When they first got together, there were press stories, weighty Katie.
That would make her a better Princess of Wales, because you're not just marrying the man, you're marrying the job.
That resonates with people. Ghislaine Maxwell agreed to be interviewed for the very first time.
I honestly wish I'd never met him.
The Conservative Party can certainly win the next election.
Can we?
Yes.
Labour 29 points ahead in the polls. Can we? Did he say, yes, I have taken drugs and they bent the rules, or lied on the visa application form and therefore got it?
There needs to be an intervention around abortion laws.
Parliament is sovereign. Parliament can determine these things.
The rest of the world has watched on in sort of mounting horror as this story has unravelled. For you, it was incredibly personal.
The death toll from the Titanic tragedy has risen to 1,522, and may God rest their souls.
Let it roll.
If we stop producing oil, the knock-on effect is far larger than just CO2.
I nearly have empathy when I'm speaking to them. I know now you're probably going to boot me off short in this go.
Get her out!
Meghan Markle. Some of them, they're easily led.
You can kiss my American ass.
Thank you very much. Very nice of you.
Twitter, you sons of Can you please reinstate my account? Thank you.
There's a threat that you'd be worried about.
So are you saying that you're being overwhelmed, that you're inundated?
We are really working hard for you. We're just asking patients to be patient with us.
What does a woman mean?
You weren't asked to give evidence to the grand jury.
I'm the only one that has been telling the truth.
You don't drink, never taken drugs. You're stinking rich. Should we be concerned, Prime Minister?
If it's on your mind, it's on talkTV.
It's about you and your opinions.
If you're thinking about it, we're talking about it.
It's all about me. That's a joke.
Welcome back to JK Investigates. Now, when people think about gambling, it's usually about the jackpot. You know, the untold fortune at the end of the bet, the ticket, or the roll of the dice. But the odds of that outcome are never in your favour. The damage to the economy and people's health has been estimated, my friends, at over £1.7 billion a year, spent on things like mental health treatment, homelessness and crime. And it's getting so bad that last year the NHS was forced to open up 2 specialist support clinics for gambling addiction just for that. So, again, who is to blame for this? What needs to change? Earlier I spoke with Labour MP and chair of the Gambling-Related Harm All-Party Parliamentary Group, Carolyn Harris, and asked if she wanted to ban gambling in its entirety.
No, not at all. I've got no problem with responsible gambling. The only time I've got a problem with gambling is where the person has an addiction and the industry exploits that vulnerability in order to make a profit off the back of them.
There are 300,000 problem gamblers in the UK, we are told. 43% of this country gamble. I've spoken candidly about myself in the past. How do current laws allow those who perhaps are addicted to be exploited?
Well, the current Gambling Act was invented or was written in 2005, which was 2 years before an iPhone was invented. So there's nothing in the legislation that takes into account technology. Ergo, the industry's gone online. They currently are doing nothing illegal. They're doing plenty immorally, but until we can get that legislation changed, that they're held accountable for what they do online, then this problem will continue to escalate.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when I was, in my late teens, early 20s, you go to the bookies. Now you can gamble 24 hours a day on your mobile phone, exactly as you say. And you see these companies, I've seen the adverts on television saying, gamble responsibly. If you can't afford it, stop. It's not really a positive thing to say to somebody who can't stop because they think they're going to have a win round the corner. And of course, we are right, you are right, social media, certainly the mobile phone, you can do it every minute of every single hour every day.
Yeah. And that message sends a message to the public that it's the individual who has to take responsibility for their gambling. It does not acknowledge that the product is designed to become addictive, just like alcohol, just like drugs. And once it's hooked you, you can't walk away from it. You can't act responsibly because you are completely lost in that world that it's trapped you in.
Do you think certain companies take advantage, and that's where the government needs to be stronger in its legislation to say, you need to be more proactive in how you care for these people rather than, in your words, exploit them?
Yeah, it's not certain companies, it's the industry, the online industry in its entirety. They saw very, very enterprising. They were very forward thinking. They saw after 2005 there was an opportunity here that when technology developed that they were going to fill that niche, and they filled it to the maximum. They've got market share. All of them have got market share on the punters, and now it's just about what they can actually do to get more and more money out of these individuals. And unfortunately, that will often mean that people will commit crime. They will lie, they will steal, and unfortunately a lot of people will take their lives because they're so desperate. And it probably won't be because of the debt they're in or for the crime they've committed, but for the embarrassment and the knowledge that they cannot escape it because they are literally trapped in a world that just keeps on dragging them back in all the time.
And what's really interesting is how you started when you said, I don't want it banned. I want some acknowledgement that legislation should change and be more wide-ranging because, of course, the gambling industry provides the UK economy with a huge amount of money, and there the government has to balance the books, I guess, between financial gain and morality, right?
Well, no, it's more than that, because if you think that NHS England will not take gambling money to fund clinics to help problem gamblers because the industry has too much influence over how the money is spent and how they should deliver the treatment. If you think about the effects it has on the individual, how many people have got long-term mental health problems? How many people have got PTSD? How many people become homeless? How many people kill themselves? How many people become benefit dependent? How many families become destitute because of a problem gambler, affected others? If you look at the cost of all that and how much it costs the government to try and keep people together after this addiction, then I think you'll find that the industry pays nowhere near into the coffers.
The only thing, Carolyn, that I would add to that, and I absolutely agree with you, but Are you then saying, if we're blaming just the companies, that it's nothing whatsoever to do with an individual? Because as somebody who used to bet too much, and I've talked about it 40 years ago, that was, I think, now I'm that bloody old. But as somebody, if I'm watching this programme right now, I'm thinking, OK, so Carolyn is saying that companies, you know, online are making it difficult for me, somebody who likes to gamble, not to gamble. But I've still got the issue. It's not for those gambling companies to deal with my issue. Is it not for me to deal with my issue? Or are you saying that there's too much associated, whether it's sports companies promoting gambling, whether it's online stuff, that I'm then dragged further in? Should the government not be doing more to help people who are gambling addicts as well as the companies who are taking advantage?
So the industry markets, as we know, and they spend a phenomenal amount of money on advertising to keep people, to attract people and to encourage people to stay in gambling. A lot of that will affect children because there will be shirt sponsorship from gambling companies. So we are normalising gambling. Kids are growing up thinking there's nothing wrong with gambling. It's a normal thing to do. And it is a normal thing to do, provided you're not addicted to it.
But you see, there's my question, which I have to ask you, and I'm not sticking up for it, but I'm steeped in sort of horse racing and everything. So I bet you always do the office sweepstake in the House of Commons for the Grand National.
I don't actually, because there's not enough of us in the office.
But you know what I mean.
I don't want to. Yeah, I'll go to the races and put a bet on a horse.
But how do we not know that you're not going to become a gambling addict if, because of the Grand National sweepstake, this is my question, you then go to horse racing and love it? I'm not quite sure how the government can police addiction.
Well, they can if it's online, because they can stop the predatory practices where if someone maxes out a credit card, which was happening regularly, and they would max out 4 or 5 credit cards, then surely it's the responsibility of the company to think, if this person's maxed out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 credit cards, why are we allowing them to immediately gamble again with another credit card?
I completely agree. And I'm that old, I remember when they started putting cash machines inside bookmakers and inside casinos and inside places where you can have a punt. There was a case, of course, wasn't there, Carol? The bookmaker was fined for behaviour, including allowing one customer to open a new account and spend something like over 23 grand in 20 minutes and allowing another to open an account and spend, I think it was nearly 18 grand in 24 hours. Those sorts of companies, you cannot say that they're taking that person's best interest at heart, right? But you know,
but there's a lot of people in that position. There's a lot of individuals who have been able to gamble obscene amounts of money, which they never in 1,000 years would they have been able to earn.
It's a bit like mortgage companies giving big mortgages to people who can't afford it, isn't it?
It's worse because these people are spending, they classed as being VIP customers, so they're classed as being really big speculative gamblers, maybe gambling as much as 15, 20, 25,000 a day. There's no affordability checks done to check how much that person is actually earning.
And by the way, they get rewarded. Dave's absolutely right, I need to know. They get rewarded for losing money. You're right, the VIP status. So actually... They're being rewarded for failure and made to feel important. That's
they can't get the money out that they win. They've got it so that there's this thing where if they win, they can't immediately withdraw the money. They have to stay there for so many hours. I think it's 48 hours. So by the time that 48 hours is up, if you're an addicted gambler, you've spent that money again and again.
Listen, I know that. Just one final question: the lottery. Do you play the lottery?
Not now. I used to, but I don't anymore.
You called it a slippery slope with casual gambling. And this is my thing. Like, I actually agree with you. But then are we going to get to a point where we say you can't go to a pub and have more than 2 drinks because you might become an alcoholic? No. There's the issue.
No, it's not about policing people's social habits. It's about it's about looking at the National Lottery for good causes. I've got very little issue with that. They don't give as much to good causes as they should do, but I've got a problem with that. If you look at the National Lottery online presence, where kids as young as 16 can play, and they were allowed to open accounts and spend 300 quid a week. Now, I don't know about you, Jeremy, but none of my 16-year-olds had £300 a week to be able to spend on lottery tickets, or when you go into a shop and you see somebody buying copious amounts of scratch cards. There is no individual who's working in a supermarket who's going to say to a person, you can't buy that, you've spent enough. It's not their job to do that. They're not there to police it. So that's my problem with the lottery, that again, it exploits those who are susceptible. Some people are chasing money out of desperation.
Yeah.
Some people are addicted and are they just don't care how much they lose. They just want to be gambling. Those are the people that we should be helping, the industry should be helping, and the government need to legislate to support.
Fascinating chat. Joining me to discuss that and more in the studio, Head of Engagement at the Good Law Project, Ellie May O'Hagan, and down the line, author and journalist Christopher Snowdon. Welcome, one and all. Ellie, can I start with you? A lot of people have talked already in the first half of this programme about regulation and whether gambling firms should be made to be more responsible. We'll talk in more detail, but my opening gambit is this. Is regulation lacking, perhaps, because of the amount of money the gambling industry garners in the United Kingdom for its economy?
I think that regulation in this country is perhaps lacking because a lot of politicians receive money from the gambling industry, and I think that affects the ability to regulate the gambling industry. I think that, as Carolyn Harris said, I think that we do have legislation, but it's out of date.
Yeah.
Because let's remember that the reason that the Gambling Act of 2005 was brought in was because there was this idea that if we liberalised gambling, that we would then bring in lots of tax that we could then use to fund public services. But actually what happened was these gambling companies, a lot of them, avoided tax. So we didn't really get the benefits that we were expecting to get.
And it was also let's be honest, it was pre the online thing and the digital,
well, exactly.
Because I started television in 2005 and online stuff wasn't happening. The world has changed, right?
Well, yeah, it's a bit like saying, let's create lots of laws around communications that only focuses on landlines. We would agree if we tried to do that it would be completely ridiculous, it wouldn't be relevant. And that's exactly what's happening with gambling at the moment. We've seen the massive increase in online gambling. It was between 2021 and 2022, it was something like a 25% increase in online gambling. And there really hasn't been much legislation at all to sort of deal with the effect that that's having on people's lives. So we really do need an update and we need better regulation.
Couldn't agree more. Christopher, welcome to Jeremy Kyle Investigates. I was interested by what Carolyn said. She said that she intimated the product of gambling in its entirety is designed to become addictive. What do you make of that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's lots of different gambling products, many of which have been around for a very long time. I don't think horse racing is designed to be addictive per se, or roulette or blackjack or any of the other games. In particular, it's a difficult question to answer, really, Jeremy, because, I mean, what exact features are we saying are particularly addictive? I mean, gambling disorder is a psychological disorder that relatively small, very small proportion of the population have. There is nothing in the gambling environment that seems to make rates of problem gambling go up or down. The rate currently is about 0.4%, which is roughly where it's been ever since we started measuring problem gambling in this country over 20 years ago. Across that period, you've seen the rise of online gambling, as you say. You've seen the rise and fall of the fixed odds betting terminals, which people like Carolyn Harris spent years campaigning about and we never hear mentioned anymore. We've seen the rise in legalisation of gambling advertising. We've seen regulation in both directions. We saw a ban on credit cards being used, incidentally, a few years ago, which Carolyn Harris still seems to think people can max out online. So we've seen all sorts of deregulation and regulation, and none of it's had any effect on the number of problem gamblers. You wouldn't really expect it to, because it is a psychological disorder that needs to be treated through rehabilitation, cognitive behavioural therapy, and it's actually a very good thing that more people are going to problem gambling clinics. That's the point of opening up more problem gambling clinics, is so you can get more people through the door, and I hope we continue to see a rise in people going to.
Interesting side to that, Ellie. What do you make of what Christopher said?
Well, I think there's two main points that I'd like to make in response to that. The first is that there's a thing called, which I'm sure you know about, but maybe your viewers don't know about, which is it's called the gross gambling yield.
Yep.
And what that is the total amount that's put on in bets in this country minus the amount that's paid out in winnings. Now, in this country, that number is £14 billion. And what we found when I was the director of the Class think tank, we did a report on this, and what we found was, this is not our statistic, we found it in another report, is that 10% of customers, they make up nearly 80% of the gross gambling yield. So that means that in this country, the industry needs addiction to be profitable. It needs people to become addicted to it. Now, I agree with what Chris said, that it's a small number of people. Like I said there, it's 10%. It's not 90%, it's 10. But that 10% is responsible for the industry being profitable. I gamble sometimes. We were discussing this before. I gamble in politics. And I have to be honest, I nearly always win. So people like me cannot possibly make the gambling industry
But you've got to be very careful when you talk about whether it's the online danger, it's companies incentivising people. We heard that guy earlier who was given free bets by a company and they knew he was in trouble. We have to be very careful. Abby said it earlier, to not tar the entire industry and anybody who wants to bet as an addict. So the question that we want to try and answer, and you've got 10 seconds, is how do we weed out the problem addicts and make sure that the industry is tougher on them? Whose responsibility, the government's or the betting firms?
It's the government's responsibility to make sure that the betting firms are not exploiting vulnerable people. And there's lots and lots of things that we can do to ensure that. So, for example, stopping people giving out freebies, stopping betting companies pestering people who are trying desperately to give up their addiction.
And maybe a mandatory levy on betting firms to pay for the treatment of addiction. Very briefly is what we talked about.
Yeah,
fair, right?
Exactly. You make the mess, which I believe these companies are by exploiting people and pestering them into continue gambling, then you clean it up. It shouldn't be ordinary people who are paying for the mess that these companies are creating.
Very interesting. So much to cram in on this hour. On next on Investigates, betting companies can offer free bets, you heard it, sponsor your football team and even gift you money for signing up. We believe. Do you? Is that fueling a dangerous habit? We're back in 3.
This is talkTV.
Welcome back. You're watching JK Investigates. Now, sports and gambling have always gone sort of hand in hand, and in recent years, that bond has become ever more apparent. Take the Premier League, for example. In the 2002-03 season, Fulham were the only team to have the logo of a gambling firm plastered on their kit. In this case, it was Betfair.com. Now take a look at this. 20 years on in the 2022-23 season, 8 teams had gambling firms displayed on their kits. Bournemouth had Daffabet, Brentford had Hollywood Bets, Everton Stake.com. Take a breath, JK. Fulham W88, Leeds SBO Top, and then Newcastle United with Fun88, Southampton with Sportsbet, and the mighty West Ham with Betway. Blimey, just so you realise, that's 40% of the entire league, but not for long, my friends. The Premier League announced early this year that as of the 26-27 season, teams will no longer be displaying gambling logos on the front of their shirts. However, and it's a case of reading the small print, of course, betting firm logos can still be displayed on the sleeves of these shirts, just not the front. Does that make a difference? Is that enough? I want to discuss gambling in its entirety. Back with Ellie May O'Hagan, Abby McGregor, and I'm also joined by, I'm going to call him an avid sports gambler. Some would say a legend, Harry Finlay. Welcome, one and all, Harry. How did gambling, sports gambling, first enter your psyche? What happened? How did you get into it?
Well, it was the horses and it was other forms of gambling first. Because when I was obsessed with football as a 5-year-old, but football betting football was never conducive with betting at all until my teenage years. And I was one of the first people who would be betting on football hackers and football when it was just in the early years in the late 70s. And football, of course, now has taken off. And the big advantage it's got, the Premier League, the reason why Premier League is so successful and so synonymous with football is also that in the rest of the world, the illegal markets in the Far East, they use the English Football League and other leagues now as well as a roulette table. They bet to 3% and 2%, 4%. So punters all over the world, not so much in England where we play to the more orthodox 14% Ladbrokes and Betfair stuff, but which is low margin. But football's become an avenue for low margin.
Does gambling, the association of sports with gambling, does it bring benefit to the sports industry, or is it just a money?
It's a knock-on effect, really, Jay. I think a lot of the success with the Premier League clubs does actually fund from the illegal markets because, the reason why the English Premier League is so popular in Asia, for example, is because, like I say, they bet to much lower margins. And I believe that punters nowadays, unlike 40 years ago when they didn't know the odds, I believe that the lower margins are what entices people in.
Well, it's quite interesting what you said, Ellie, because I was a bit shocked. You said you gamble, but you gamble on politics and you rarely get it wrong. That's insider information, isn't it? It's insider trading.
No, it's just being able to read the runes. It's just, I think, the point that I was trying to make is that I rarely gamble, and when I do, I gamble on something that I feel...
But he would tell you that and you would support this as well, a successful gambler, right? This is my point about the whole show. He might have one bet a year. It might be 5-4 or even money, and they'll lay it out and they know it's going to win. That's a fact. We're talking about the people who sit in bookies, right, in the old days, back on 6 dog meetings, 6 horse race meetings and do their dough. And then there's cash points, and then they can get credit, and then they can go online. That's the danger. But what Abby, Harry, said at the beginning of this part, wasn't it, was that you said we can't label everybody as an addict and a problem gambler. There are people who can gamble healthily.
But what I was saying in the earlier segment is that while I agree, actually the majority of people are not problem gamblers, the industry relies on addicts. That's where it makes money. It needs people to become addicted. And that might only be a small proportion of the overall population that gambles. Like, more people gamble like I do than gamble like that.
Well, if
everybody gambled like I did, the industry would go bankrupt. It needs people to become addictive. That's why it plies addicts with free money. That's why it sends them designer handbags. That's why it begs them to come back and start betting.
What would you say to that, Abby?
I think the big problem is that everyone's looking for someone to blame. Is it the government? Is it the addicts? Is it the advertisers? Is it the gambling firms? The fact is that some people are addicted. That is the way that they are. That's not a disparaging accusation, but we have to accept that people gamble in different ways. Some do so very harmfully, and they're in the minority. Everybody else can gamble quite freely.
Can I come back on that, actually? Because I did a report for class when I was director of class, and we interviewed lots of different people who had problematic gambling habits. And actually, yes, a lot of them did meet the criteria that you've just described. But there was a group, and it was primarily single mums who were at home alone at night with not much to do, who didn't have any history of addiction, and they became addicted alarmingly quickly to gambling. And
listen, we haven't got a lot of time, but I think there's a massive difference, and I want to bring Harry in on this, between online gambling and what it was. If we take it back to sports, here's a question for you. The Premier League is beamed round the world, as you said. If there are gambling shirts on the front of all these football matches shown to billions of people, is that dragging people into gambling? Yes or no?
Not around the world directly, no, because a lot of those shirts in the Premier Leagues are English-based. Some of them are.
All right, but is it encouraging people? I mean, we don't do cigarette gambling. We don't do cigarette advertising.
It's obviously encouraging people, otherwise they wouldn't spend money on the adverts.
I think the bigger problem with the adverts are not where they are placed on the shirt or what time the adverts are. I think in gambling, education is a big problem, Jeremy. And I think that punters need to be educated.
By whom?
Well, what they don't need is Jeff Stelling. Jeff's a great lad in that, but these celebrities promoting things like Build-A-Bet, promoting the Ladbrokes, the Ladzackers and all that, promoting bets that they know, the Build-A-Bet and Cash Out, which these firms advertise, is the worst value any punter can get. Cash Out now is one of the biggest winners for bookmakers.
But they're not illegal. This is my problem. I think it's very, very easy.
It should be illegal to be going on TV and telling people what good value Build-A-Bet is when everyone knows it's the worst value in the world. And what we should be doing, people like me and you perhaps, Jeremy, should be sitting down and telling people, look, if you're going to bet on... You can win betting on football. Young people, football punters can bet on football exactly like Ellie bets on politics.
But the argument's not whether you can win or not. I mean, I've got a thing that I have to say... I was told years ago, and I don't know whether Harry would agree. I used to have a problem, and I still bet. And the difference is, and I genuinely mean that, I was told by an old mate of mine, you should only gamble what you can afford to lose. And it's that desperation to get it back or have the big hit or go to the cash point or look at the glamorising or what I can... That's the problem, but I don't quite know how you are supposed, Abby, to work out that that person might become a complete addict and a problem person and that person's just in control of it. Who's supposed to police that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing you have to do is you have to separate out the cognitive clinical stuff to this kind of quasi-sociology stuff, because the argument about marketing, that assumes that humans have no free will.
Yeah, absolutely.
That we are at the complete mercy of what is marketed to us. And if the problem was the product, if the problem was the gambling product that's being advertised to us, why is it that 63% of those who are gambling addicts also cite a problem with alcohol? It's not the product, it's not the advertising, it's the cognitive structure of the addict.
I've literally got 20 seconds. Should gambling be more regulated, yes or no?
Yeah, of course it should, because if you are somebody that is more prone to addiction, it's obviously going to make it worse if there's posters for gambling companies.
Yes or no, more regulation?
Educate punters, no casinos, no online casinos for those vulnerable women that Ellie was talking about.
Yeah.
That's what we need. Casinos online should be banned. There should be none of them. And we need to, especially the Gambling Commission and people that Ellie are working with, there needs to be a big... The casinos, games of luck, games of chance are separate to games of skill. And horse racing,
guys, I could sit here with you all night. Harry Finley, Abby McGregor, Ellie Mayer-Hagan for now. Thank you. Next on Jeremy Kyle Investigates, over a quarter of the population still play the National Lottery. Is it just a bit of fun, or is it another thing that's enticing millions into the sordid world of gambling? What do you reckon? I'm coming back in 3.
Good evening, I'm Piers Morgan, uncensored in New York City.
Yeah.
King Piers and King Cube.
I think there's only room for one king, man. You know what I'm saying?
He's mocked your weight, Trump.
Yeah, look at him. Fail. Stop working.
Just because they're skin folk don't mean they're kin folk.
Do you believe you can win this war?
You're making me cry again.
They're trying to force you out. Yes, I feel betrayed.
Keep it award-winning. Mwah.
Hugh Edwards has been revealed as the presenter at the centre of the BBC scandal.
He is the most important television presenter on the BBC that we pay for.
Whatever torture he may have been going through, in some way is an excuse
Yeah.
for what appears to be an abuse of power.
when they first got together, there were press stories, weighty Katie.
That would make her a better Princess of Wales, because you're not just marrying the man, you're marrying the job.
That resonates with people. Ghislaine Maxwell agreed to be interviewed for the very first time.
I honestly wish I'd never met him.
The Conservative Party can certainly win the next election.
Can we?
Yes.
Labour
absolutely.
29 points ahead in the polls. Can we?
Did he say, yes, I have taken drugs and they bent the rules, or lied on the visa application form and therefore got it?
There needs to be an intervention around abortion laws.
Parliament is sovereign. Parliament can determine these things.
The rest of the world has watched on in sort of mounting horror as this story has unravelled. For you, it was incredibly personal.
The death toll from the Titanic tragedy has risen to 1,522, and may God rest their souls.
Let it roll.
If we stop producing oil, the knock-on effect is far larger than just CO2.
I nearly have empathy when I'm speaking to them. I know now you're probably going to boot me off the short in this now. Oh, Meghan Markle, about Meghan Markle. Some of them, they're easily led.
You can kiss my American ass. Thank you very much. Very nice of you.
Twitter, you sons of Can you please reinstate my account?
Yeah,
Thank you.
There's a threat that you'd be worried about.
So are you saying that you're being overwhelmed, that you're inundated? We are really working hard for you, and we're just asking patients to be patient with us.
What is a woman, me?
You weren't asked to give evidence to the grand jury.
I'm the only one that has been telling the truth.
You don't drink, never taken drugs. You're stinking rich. Should we be concerned, Prime Minister?
If it's on your mind, it's on talkTV.
Is about you and your opinions.
If you're thinking about it, we're talking about it.
It's all about me. That was a joke.
Welcome back. You're watching Jeremy Kyle Investigates Gambling. Now let's turn to the National Lottery. They say 60% of UK adults play their games. But what does the National Lottery actually do? Since its creation in '94, the lottery has helped to create 6,800 new millionaires. In an average week, players raise 34 million quid for projects across the UK and over £47 billion for good causes since it began. Last year, 40% of lottery funds were spent on health, education, environment and charitable causes. So is it a force for good and right? Well, clearly it does a lot for society, and it's certainly become part of, I guess you'd say, our culture. But as we've been discussing this hour, can it act as a gateway into a more severe gambling addiction? Abby McGregor, Ellie Mayo-Hagan, still here. Ellie, does the National Lottery provide that gateway? Is it like the thing that people will get, thrilled by, and then amazingly they'll go and do other gambling? Or is it a bit of fun? We have to be careful here, don't we?
I think it depends on which part of the lottery that you're talking about. I think, judging from the research that I've done and from the families that I've talked to that have been impacted by gambling as part of my Roll Up Good Law project, what we found is that actually no one has experienced the weekly draw as a sort of gateway. No one, I mean, this is anecdotal, but this is a very different situation to scratch cards.
Well, it's only once a week, for example, isn't it? I mean, you can buy 10. I'm going to absolutely put... It's not a gateway, is it? Just having a bit of fun with the lottery, is it?
This is
not going to win anyway.
This is where it's all wrong again. We're trying to separate out the lottery, the slots, the sports betting. If you are an addict, no form of gambling is safe. If you are an ordinary healthy bettor, which make up the vast, vast majority of gamblers, every form of gambling is safe for you.
That's just not true. I think it's really important for me to come back on that, because I've spoken to lots of people who don't have any history of addiction who have become addicted to online slots. Because...
Yeah, but we're talking about the lottery here.
I know,
Let's talk about the fact that a 16-year-old can go and buy a ticket. Is that right?
Well, I hear what you're saying, but I just think it's very important to say that there are this specific group of people who don't have a history of addiction, who are getting addicted extremely fast to online slots. and losing lots and lots of money very, very quickly. So, for example, I spoke to one woman who the time between her putting her first bet on and seeking out help for addiction was 2 weeks, and she didn't have any history of addiction. So actually, there is a specific form of gambling.
Is the attraction? Is it the money? Is it, as I've said all through the show, is it, you know, that one big moment, I can get there? I worry, sorry, it's me, that we've become a society where you can't do bloody anything. We're going to have absolutely no free will, and you can't buy a lottery ticket because you might end up wanting to play poker.
No one is saying that addiction cannot be provoked. At some stage, there is something that's going to happen to you if you're an addict where you become addicted.
And that's the point about the show.
That's where you
Whose responsibility is that moment, that red flag? Is it online companies? Is it the government? I mean, certainly that guy at the beginning who was offered free gambling money, that's ridiculous.
Right.
That's a Mickey take.
There is no evidence, from what I can see from my field of neuroscience, that addiction can be prevented, stopped or cured. It can only be treated, identified and managed. So you have to have harm markers in place in the gambling companies, clinical harm markers, so they can pass it on to clinicians with a specialisation in addiction recovery, so that you're not having the proverbial bottle snatched from your hands.
Well, this is what we were talking about before. Who's going to pay for that recovery? You think a levy on gambling firms, bookmakers who make huge profits.
And that's in the white paper, the statutory.
You agree with that, don't you?
I do, and I think it's really important in terms of, you know, what can regulation do. I think a really good example of this is smoking. So obviously 50 years ago, everybody smoked. Some people had really terrible smoking habits that ended up killing them. I remember when I was a cleaner at a hospital, I met someone whose legs had been amputated because he'd smoked so much. You know, it has terrible consequences. But I think we would all agree that the legislation that's been introduced over decades about smoking has meant that the vast majority of people have stopped smoking. And actually, it has stopped lots of people developing addictions. It has saved lots of lives.
I think we have to be really
so
careful.
The evidence shows us that regulation does work.
I think you're right, but I think...
We've got to be really careful not to say any kind of regulation means banning.
No, but we also...
and that's
the flip side is we have to be really careful that it's not another thing that people jump on and say, you shouldn't gamble at all.
Nobody is doing that. Not even the the people who want the strongest regulations are doing that. People are saying there is regulation that we can introduce that will save lives. People kill themselves because they have gambling addictions. I've met the families of people that have done that. This is really serious.
I know.
There is legislation that can save lives. We need to introduce it. There's no excuse.
I literally have 10 seconds. Would you agree? It needs to change?
You cannot compare tobacco with gambling because tobacco is an indiscriminately harmful activity.
Ladies, you're going to have to carry on in the green room. Thank you very much indeed. That's all I have time for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. Jeremy Kyle investigates the gambling world. What did you think? See you soon. Ta-ra.